During the depths of the last glacial period, the lands of Europe were home to a continent-spanning culture of hunter-gatherers. Known as the Gravettians, these resilient people were able to etch out a living across the vast landscape. Unbeknownst to them, the world was becoming even colder, and much of their territory became uninhabitable. The onset to the last glacial maximum forced these bands to move, and their culture became disconnected and impoverished. West of the Alps, bands of hunter-gatherers retreated to temperate areas. A new and innovative culture would eventually form from the ashes of the Gravettians. Spanning from roughly 22,000 to 17,000 years ago, the Solutreans emerged to herald a period of innovation and adaptation. Known for their exquisite stone tool craftsmanship, especially the iconic Solutrean point, these people mastered the art of stoneworking and survival during some of the coldest times in human history. In this documentary, we will delve into the archaeological findings that illuminate the Solutrean way of life. We will also be covering the controversial Solutrean hypothesis, which posits that this culture may have been the first to make it to the Americas. This topic will be discussed at the very end of the video. So without further ado, let's learn about these innovative survivors. The Solutrean culture was first identified at the Grotte du Chanier site at the Rock of Solutre in eastern France. The Rock of Solutre is a limestone escarpment dating to the Mesozoic period that looks over the nearby commune of Solutre-Pouilly. Excavation of the site started in 1866 and horse bones were quickly found. Later, archaeologist Henri Testo-Ferry discovered layers dating to the Upper Paleolithic that were full of animal bones, flint tools, and tombs. Ferry took great care of the remains in stratigraphic context. His work would help establish a chronology for the site. It was clear that the site represented a particularly well-preserved hunting camp from a unique culture not fully understood. Years later, after discoveries of similar advanced stone tools and symbolic elements, the site at the Rock of Solutre would come to be the name of this entire culture. Over a century later, we have learned a lot about the Solutrean culture and their incredible achievements. The Proto-Solutrean appeared as far back as 25,000 years ago, while the Solutrean proper lasted until around 17,000 years ago. They developed ingenious technology and increased their population during some of the coldest times in human history. To understand where this incredible culture came from, we must first talk about what happened to the preceding culture, the Gravettians. The end of the Gravettian culture was caused by the worsening of climatic conditions during the last glacial maximum. This was the coldest time during the last glacial period. As temperatures plummeted, glaciers expanded and vast swaths of territory became uninhabitable. From Britain even to southern Germany, we find no evidence of late Gravettian camps and hardly anyone even lived along the Danube. While the northern areas became gradually colder, southern areas such as the Iberian Peninsula or the Balkans witnessed alternating humidity rather than temperature oscillations. The once connected Gravettian Europe became fractured. Two major population centers emerged, one east of the Alps in southern France and Iberia, and one west of the Alps in Italy, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. During the onset of the last glacial maximum, these populations became separated by around 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles, where almost no sites in between are reported. Starting around 26,000 years ago, the separation of these once relatively homogeneous people led to the development of distinct cultures on both sides of the Alps. The people to the east emerged to form the Epigravettian culture, a tradition which created smaller, simpler points than their Gravettian ancestors and who took less of a focus on symbolic elements. In the hostile conditions of the plains, they appear to have lived difficult lives that left little time for making crafts or developing their culture. In the more favorable conditions of southwestern Europe, the people of the region were able to develop the rich Solutrean culture. They were primarily known for their amazing stoneworking ability, but also for their other arts such as cave paintings and engravings. Before going into their culture, we should briefly talk about their genetics. Genomic sequencing of two Solutrean individuals, one from Loupiage in southwestern France and a younger one in La Riera in northern Spain, have revealed interesting things about these individuals. They both show relatedness with the earlier Gravettian Fornal cluster and the later Magdalenian Goyet Q2 cluster. The Fornal cluster originates during the Aurignacian, with the oldest individual dating to 35,000 years ago from Belgium. This cluster would go on to found the Western Gravettian populations. Solutrean populations are essentially the genetic descendants of the Western Gravettian populations. When considering any Upper Paleolithic European population, we must understand that their genetics differ greatly from modern Europeans. Modern Europeans descend from various migrations which occurred much later, such as the Neolithic farmers and the Indo-Europeans. Less than a third of the genetics of most modern European populations come from these Upper Paleolithic people, and this third is primarily made up of later Mesolithic populations which themselves differ greatly from the Solutrean people. The point is, though these people were European, they were much different than the modern inhabitants of the land. The physical remains of the Solutrean people have unveiled interesting things about their physical appearance. Compared to their hardy Gravettian ancestors, they were slightly more gracile. Males were still quite tall, being up to 179 centimeters or around 5'11". Solutrean remains from Portugal display that Solutrean females had fairly gracile bodies compared to the relatively stocky women of the Gravettian. Examinations of the teeth of Solutrean individuals reveal that they were similar to the teeth of Gravettians and older Upper Paleolithic people, which are quite large compared to many modern Europeans. The facial shape of Solutrean people would have resembled Aurignacian or Gravettian populations to some extent. They would have had relatively robust faces with prominent brow ridges and strong jaws. They may have looked European, though their faces would have had a combination of features not seen in any modern European group. The skin color of Solutrean people would have been darker than modern European populations. This is because they still lacked the alleles for lighter pigmentation that appeared only around 19,000 years ago, though would not become common for a few thousand years. They certainly had lighter skin than the Aurignacians and likely lighter skin than the Gravettians, though little research has been done on the Solutreans in particular. They would have had darker skin than modern native Spanish or Portuguese people, and it likely varied from people living north of the Pyrenees and those on the coast of southern Iberia. Overall, the Solutreans likely resembled Western Gravettian people as well as subsequent Magdalenian and some Mesolithic Europeans. The Proto-Solutrean culture first appeared around 26,000 years ago. This was well within the last glacial maximum, which started around the same time and would only end around 19,000 years ago. This was one of the coldest times since modern humans had been in Europe. Large glaciers covered much of northern Europe and covered many mountain ranges. The sea level was also much lower, opening up vast swaths of productive land. Despite the frigid temperatures, the middle latitudes of the Solutrean world, such as Cantabrian Spain and southern France, were home to a steppe tundra grassland that fed large herds of ungulates and other animals. Outside of this area, most of the Solutrean world was relatively treeless and hostile. Sites along the Mediterranean coast would have been relatively warm, though inland Iberia was hardly inhabited. The Solutrean world was much different than prior periods of the Upper Paleolithic. As mentioned earlier, they were separated from Eastern Gravettian populations by around 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles. They were restricted to the Iberian Peninsula and areas of southern France. Sites are known from northern France, though the frigid conditions made this area a frontier of Solutrean occupation. Solutrean archaeological sites essentially cover two rings, one surrounding the coast of the entire Iberian Peninsula and one circling the French Massif. The two rings were connected by narrow choke points through the glacial-covered Pyrenees Mountains. These so-called rings are not consistent and are rather made up of a variety of centers with desolate lands between them. Bands of Solutreans would have moved between these population centers during different seasons. The interior of Iberia appears to have been too hostile for human occupation, though a handful of sites can be found in south-central Spain. Though they lived during exceptionally cold times, through extensive exploitation of their local environments, they were able to increase their population from Gravettian times. To put their population size in perspective, the Aurignacian people only numbered around 1,500 individuals across Western and Central Europe, while the Gravettians numbered around 2,800. The Solutreans numbered between 750 and 3,600 people in the Franco-Cantabrian region, though I was unable to find a total population estimate for their entire range. We do know that the Solutreans were the only Upper Paleolithic population which actually saw growth during the last glacial maximum. This is likely due to the influx of immigrants coming from the northern regions which became uninhabitable. A total population of the Solutrean people would likely be less than around 5,000, considering that their world was much smaller than the vast territory occupied by the Aurignacians or Gravettians. Still, it is very impressive that they were able to grow their population during the conditions of the last glacial maximum. The period can thus be seen as a recovery from the apocalyptic conditions of the late Gravettian. I should also mention that we have lost many Solutrean coastal sites due to the rising sea levels at the end of the last glacial period. Vast areas of the Solutrean world now unfortunately lie under the sea. The colder conditions of the last glacial maximum were unsuitable for many animal species which were once widespread in Western Europe during Gravettian and Aurignacian times. Animals such as boar, red deer, and aurochs were forced to move into southern France and Iberia. Across the Solutrean world, horses and reindeer were quite abundant in Iberia and north of the Pyrenees Mountains. Other animals included ibex, megaloceros, woolly mammoth, woolly rhino, and predators like wolves, bear, and cave lion. Depending on the region, populations of these animals heavily varied, and the Solutreans had to adapt their techniques and technologies to exploit them. The Upper Paleolithic is a time known for its innovative technology, and the Solutrean is no exception. The Solutreans developed their flint-knapping techniques far beyond any other culture of the time and created truly impressive tools. In order to understand their stoneworking technology, we must first understand the entire history of the development of stone tools. The first stone tools were simple stone cores with a sharp edge. Homo erectus refined these tools into Acheulean hand axes with much better edges. Middle Paleolithic humans, including the ancestors of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, created a technology known as Mousterian or Lavawa, which used the flakes taken off of cores as tools. This allowed for the creation of ready-made tools with little effort. The next major innovation in stone technology was the creation of blade core technology in the Upper Paleolithic. We have talked extensively about these tools in this series so far, but to summarize, this technology consisted of taking long blades off of a core that could be turned into tools. These blades were often used as projectile points or attached to the sides of wooden or bone halves to form composite points. Large bone points without blades were also heavily used since the Aurignacian. The previously covered Gravettian culture used long blades on the sides of projectile points to take down various animals, including mammoths. This technique would be carried on in the east with the Epigravettian culture, but the Solutreans took a much different path. Instead of creating complicated composite projectiles which required the blades to be replaced when dull, the Solutreans began to focus on creating large bifacial points while continuing to produce small shouldered blade points. Though the question remains, why did they switch to creating large bifacial points? Bifacial points are much harder to make than replaceable ones. Researchers are not entirely sure why they moved away from composite projectiles. It may have been tied to the lack of wood or ivory during the last glacial maximum. What we do know is that these bifacial points would overtake the composite points for all the groups west of the Alps. Complex bifacial points were made long before the Solutreans in Africa and in early European cultures, though the Solutreans would develop the technology further than any other had before them. Complex Solutrean points did not just appear out of nowhere. We have been able to observe a clear development in point-making technique in the archaeological record. The first appearance of large points ancestral to Solutrean points are known as Valle Comprido points. They are fairly large flat points that were made from flakes and then worked on one side to make a more symmetrical and thinner point. These points are not very impressive, though they would eventually spread all over Spain and are clearly the predecessors to proper Solutrean points. It would take around 1,500 years of gradual improvement in stoneworking techniques to develop truly thin and symmetrical bifacial points. A bifacial point is simply a point that is worked on both sides. This allows the flint knapper to control the exact shape of the final point. Unifacial points can be fine, though they are typically quite unsymmetrical, which makes penetration less efficient, they break easier, and they are harder to haft. Bifacial flint knapping, on the other hand, is much more difficult, but it creates a much better product. The development of bifacial points may have been a direct product of resharpening dull points. Valle Comprido points were created on unsymmetrical flakes and were slightly refined to become more symmetrical. A true Solutrean point, on the other hand, is heavily worked to create a much finer product. To understand how these points were made, I will be making one myself. Solutrean points were made with a number of techniques which developed during the Solutrean culture. First, we know that they used hard and soft hammers to rough out the point. A hard hammer is typically made of another stone and is used in the initial shaping of the core. This process is difficult and requires knowledge of how to set up platforms on a stone core in order to create a large flake. As a flint knapper, you must look at an edge and envision how you're going to set up a platform to remove a flake. Luckily with the internet, I have been able to learn some of the basics of these techniques after a few years, though I am still very incompetent compared to Solutrean knappers. One technique that the Solutreans are known for would be overshot flaking. This technique can be difficult and also very risky. By hitting a platform with excessive power, a flake is taken off of the whole face of the other edge of the point. If done correctly, this can be used to drastically thin a point and also set up platforms on the other side of the point. This technique can accidentally be done on occasion, though the Solutreans harnessed its ability to thin to create some truly exceptional points. I was only able to get one overshot flake on this point, and it was barely an overshot flake, but it still counts. Another technique which the Solutreans used was pressure flaking. This consists of using a tool, most likely an antler or a bone, to push off a flake with pressure rather than percussion. This technique is used for pushing off long thinning flakes for specific areas and for putting the finishing edge on a point. And after the point is completed, it is also used to resharpen the point. Perhaps after watching a little bit of flint knapping, you can understand why it took the Solutreans around 1500 years to go from Valle Comprido points to the refined Solutrean points. The development of these techniques appear to have spread throughout Iberia and southern France during this time. The vast improvement of flint knapping techniques during the Solutrean appears to have been directly related to the population increase these regions experienced. In human history, more people often means more innovation. Though I have been speaking as if Solutrean points are one uniform design, they were actually very diverse. There are many different sizes and shapes of Solutrean points, often tied to local regions. The most well-known of which were the laurel leaf bifaces. These bifaces are often lanceolate, symmetrical, and thin. They appeared along with the Solutrean proper around 22,000 years ago. Their shape can vary, though they are generally elongated and leaf-shaped with a pointed base. Some were quite small at around 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches, though larger examples are as much as 25 centimeters or 10 inches in length. Variations of these large bifaces are found in various regions of Iberia. More rounded points, referred to as willow leaf points, differed from the typical shape. Other variations in shape are known and may reflect local cultural differences. These points are generally thought to have been used as knives or to have been mounted on large thrusting spears. Large bifaces are very useful for these roles. Stone knives must be resharpened by taking flakes off their edge, which reduces the overall size of the point. Larger bifaces can thus be resharpened many times before being exhausted. They were also useful as thrusting spears due to their pure size. A stab from a 25 centimeter or 10-inch leaf-shaped point would cause a fatal wound to almost any animal of the glacial period. Laurel leaf points are exceptional, though a variation called Volgu points are even more astounding. The degree of skill and investment of resources used in Solutrean tool manufacture is apparent in the 15 laurel leaf points found in the Volgu cache. The points are between 25 to 35 centimeters or 10 to 14 inches in length, while also being extremely thin. Some points are less than 10 millimeters or 0.4 inches in thickness, while being 35 centimeters or 13 inches in length. This is an exceptional accomplishment in flint knapping technique. At the time, these bifaces were undoubtedly some of the finest ever made by our species, though eventually later cultures would go on to create some points on par with the Volgu cache. Interestingly, the points were far too large and thin to have been used as effective spears. They could have been used as knives, though only 2 of the 15 bifaces display any evidence of limited cutting. None of them display evidence of hafting, suggesting that they may have been held onto as symbolic objects. Master flint knapper Jacques Pellegrin determined that the points were created likely by one or maybe a few extraordinary flint artists. During my research into this topic, I just couldn't help but think of an aging flint knapping master surrounded by all of their tools at the finest flint quarry in France. Though it is easy to imagine this figure as a weathered old man, it is just as possible that a matriarch was the master. Male knappers have a tendency to try to muscle through problems within the rock, often leading to the destruction of the preform. I have admittedly done it many times. The reality is that we have no idea who made these works. Could it have been a young hotshot? Possibly, but modern master flint knappers have a very difficult time reproducing some of the finer Solutrean points. The finished points of the Volgu cache must have been highly prized. A vast amount of time and resources went into just gathering the materials necessary. The suspicion of researchers that these tools had a deeper symbolic meaning is supported by the way that they are deposited. They were placed pointing upwards side by side in the ground. We can only speculate on the purpose of burying such prized items. Other Stone Age cultures around the world were known to cache tools for later use or for deeper purposes often connected to burial or ritual. These tools were never recovered, and it is unlikely that this group would simply forget the location of tools which required so much work to create. The Volgu cache is the pinnacle of the wider Solutrean napping phenomenon of deciding to go above and beyond in the creation of stone tools. The expert skill put into their manufacture is as impressive as the stone they chose to work. They often chose extremely high-quality stone from faraway lands. Nappable stone varies heavily in its ability to be worked. Some stones are rough and hard to send flakes across. Other stones can be like glass, such as obsidian and high-quality flint. The Solutreans were highly aware of the quality of their napping materials and often brought high-quality materials vast distances to create their tools. They even chose to flint knap quartz, which is often difficult though beautiful. Low-quality napping materials are much harder to work with, though the Solutreans found a way around this. They were one of the first cultures to heat-treat their napping materials. Heat-treating stone in a fire makes it more brittle, but it also can become much easier to flint knap. The stone can become glossy and even change color. Flint can only get treated to around 300 degrees Celsius or 500 degrees Fahrenheit before it gets too brittle for tool use. Campfires often burn much hotter than this, posing a unique challenge for heat-treating stone. From analysis of 44 heat-treated laurel leaf points from France, it was found that the Solutreans were able to heat these tools precisely in this narrow window. The study concluded that the heat-treating technique must have been highly standardized and allowed for reproducible results. Heat-treating stone was developed in a variety of cultures worldwide and dates all the way back to 164,000 years ago in South Africa. Though this heat treating was done on coarse-grained silicrete, which can be heat-treated directly in an open fire. The Solutreans do appear to have been the first culture to heat-treat fine-grained materials such as chert to produce better flaking properties. This technique would eventually be lost in Europe before being rediscovered thousands of years later. Some points are easy to tell if they've been heat-treated, while others are difficult to identify due to natural variations in the color and texture of flint or chert. The bifaces found at the Volgu cache were so exceptional that researchers suspected that they may have been heat-treated. Though a 2018 study found that these points were likely not heat-treated even if their makers were aware of these techniques. Rather, they were made from a very high-quality raw flint from as much as 260 kilometers or 160 miles from the site. Heat-treating the points might have only posed unneeded risk for the material which they had already spent so much time collecting and transporting. Though it is easy to get caught up with their beautiful laurel leaf bifaces, they also used a large variety of other stone points and tools. The creation of fine blades continues into the Solutrean period. Unifacially or bifacially retouched blades were often used to create small projectile points. Some were simply left with their natural pointed edges, while others were made into well-made shouldered points. Some of these shouldered points are masterpieces in their own right. Pressure flaking a blade into a shape like this is no easy task. The final product is a deadly point which can be securely hafted with ease. Shouldered points and other smaller points were likely used on the tips of darts. The Solutrean is the first culture that we know for sure used the spear thrower or the atlatl. We know this from a bone hook that was found in France. It was found alongside many shouldered points, some of which were broken and discarded. Hooks are used in spear throwers to hold on to the projectile while it is being accelerated. To be clear, we are almost certain that Gravettian and even Aurignacian hunters used spear throwers based on the wear on their stone and bone points. But this is the earliest evidence of an actual spear thrower. Spear throwers can be made in many ways and often only require wood or rope, but the addition of a bone hook makes the spear thrower much more durable. The subsequent Magdalenian culture would go on to create many amazing spear throwers, but that is a topic for another day. Spear throwers are fantastic weapons that have been used from Australia to the Arctic. Many typically assume that the bow and arrow is undeniably superior, though modern researchers have found that this is not necessarily the case. Spear throwers allow a range of benefits that the bow and arrow does not. Much larger projectiles can be thrown with the spear thrower. The weapon system is also much easier to make, though darts take up more resources than an arrow. It is important to mention that these hooked or shouldered points are often found among large bifaces such as laurel leaf points. It is apparent that these stone tools represent specialized use. It is also important to mention that point styles, whether projectiles or larger bifaces, vary by region. Some researchers have even speculated that these styles represent cultural differences, while others believe it has more to do with point function. Some of the most unique points made by the Solutreans were tanged and winged points. They feature exceptional pressure flaking, such as well-made tangs and needle-nosed tips. They were undoubtedly made by master flint-knappers. These points are only found in southern Iberia and may represent the use of the bow and arrow. As mentioned in the Aurignacian and Gravettian videos, bow technology may have been present in Europe very early on. It may have even been carried with some of the first modern humans in Europe around 54,000 years ago. Other evidence from the Gravettians suggests that some groups may have used this technology close in time to the Solutrean culture. The design of these points are very unique for the Upper Paleolithic, a design that would be rediscovered much later by Neolithic communities. A test on recreations of Solutrean barbed points found that they could be efficiently shot with a bow and arrow. The evidence supports the idea that some communities were hafting stone points to their arrows thousands of years before traditionally thought. The Solutreans used a variety of other stone tools such as scrapers, burins, and drills. Scrapers may have been hafted onto handles to more effectively scrape hides. Stone drills were often made from blade blanks or flakes. These drills may have been hafted to devices to spin them much faster, such as bow drills or pump drills. This may have helped them drill into bone, and these tools may have also been used to create fire. Another tool which you are probably sick of hearing about by now on my channel are burins. Burins or birins are stone tools with a steep edge used to shape hard materials. They are very useful to shape bone, antler, and ivory. Though the Solutreans generally moved away from bone points, some are still found at their sites. Bone points can be made very long, allowing them for devastating penetration into game animals. They are also quite durable and reusable. Another tool that they may have made from bone or ivory are throwing sticks or boomerangs. A 23,000-year-old ivory boomerang was found all the way in Poland dating to the Gravettian period. Though we do not have direct evidence for this technology, it is very likely throwing sticks were being used, as our evidence goes back around 400,000 years. Other strange bone objects from the Solutrean are pointed at one end with grooves, and they appear to have been plugs used on water skins. When considering Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, we often forget that staying hydrated was just as or even more important than staying fed. This may be some of the oldest evidence of portable water containers in the archaeological record. Perhaps the most important tool made of bone during the Solutrean was the eyed needle. The creation of clothing during the last glacial maximum was among the most important skills. Though the Solutreans of Iberia got to enjoy warmer conditions, winter still would have been frigid, and populations north of the Pyrenees certainly had to wear well-made clothing. Hides had to be harvested, scraped, tanned, and skillfully sewn into insulating clothing. This process would have been very laborious, considering every member of the tribe, including children, required clothing and regular repairs. Like other Paleolithic cultures, a variety of furs would have been used for different garments. Thick and insulating hides would have been used for parkas and leggings, while smaller garments would have taken advantage of the pliability of the hides of rabbits, foxes, and wolverines. Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of direct evidence of clothing from the Solutrean, though it was undoubtedly an extremely important aspect of their lives. Let's take a break from the video to talk about today's sponsor, Storyblocks, the ultimate stock media subscription service. A subscription to Storyblocks gets you access to unlimited downloads of diverse, high-quality media for a single predictable subscription cost. No more expensive pay-per-clip pricing. Their vast library includes over 1 million 4K or HD footage, templates, music, sound effects, images, and more. making it a one-stop shop for all of your creative needs. I have actually been using Storyblocks for over 4 years at this point, and you've already seen some of their stock videos in this documentary. As a creator, time is of the essence, and Storyblocks help me save hours with their pre-made motion graphic templates. They have content for After Effects, Premiere Pro, Apple Motion, and DaVinci Resolve. Speaking of DaVinci Resolve, their new templates are a game changer, offering customizable options to create professional-looking videos quickly and efficiently. One of the best things about Storyblocks is their commitment to keeping you legally covered. All of their content is 100% royalty-free, and you are protected in perpetuity by the highest level of legal coverage in the industry. To get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/northo2 or click the link in the description. I have legitimately been using Storyblocks for years, and I highly recommend their service. Huge thanks to Storyblocks, and now let's get back to the video. Like other Upper Paleolithic cultures, the Solutreans were great hunters and efficient gatherers. Their sites often contain large megafaunal species as well as smaller mammals and even aquatic resources. Evidence of their hunting prowess was discovered at their type site of Solutre. Based on the concentration of remains, it is estimated that between 30,000 to 100,000 horses were killed over a period of around 20,000 years. The vast accumulation of remains at the site has baffled researchers for over a century. How were people with hand-thrown spears able to routinely kill such a vast amount of horses? Researchers had once assumed that the hunters led the horses off of the rock of Solutre to fall to their death. After all, this has been observed with Native Americans and their famous bison jumps. This hypothesis was discarded due to the realization that none of the remains are found on the other side of the cliff. The bones are found on the southern side of the ridge. Here, there was a gradual slope. Subsequent research has found that the horses naturally crossed by the rock of Solutre during seasonal migrations. Realizing this, hunters likely drove the horses into a natural curve in the rock that would have hindered their movement, effectively corralling them while the hunters had a moment to attack. All at once, a band of horses, perhaps numbering 30 or more, would have run into a volley of stone-tipped darts. With 10 or more hunters throwing darts, dozens of projectiles could have been thrown in less than a minute. After all was said and done, horses over 500 pounds or 225 kilograms lay dead at their feet. Every hunt would have gone differently, but assuming 10 horses could be killed on a good hunt, at an average of 500 pounds and 50% edible meat and organs, these hunters could have had around 2,500 pounds of food. Inuit people living in cold conditions in a traditional lifestyle can eat 5 to 10 pounds of meat per day. Even at the higher end of caloric intake, this amount of meat could take a band of 30 hunter-gatherers a few weeks to eat through. Despite the stereotypes regarding hunter-gatherers, at large kill sites, a lot of meat is often left to spoil, and this is no different at Solutre. Cut marks on the bones are quite rare and often sporadic. The hunters appear to have only been targeting choice cuts from these beasts to bring to their nearby campsite. Solutre itself shows little evidence of human habitation. Only some tools are found which are associated with processing game. Though only 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles away, a habitation site has been discovered known as the Rock of Vergision. Hunters may have brought their choice cuts to the habitation site at Vergision to be consumed. This may have been to ward off any predators which would surely be attracted to the rest of the remains left at Solutre. This strategy seems to have originated as far back as 37,000 years ago during the Aurignacian culture and carried along all the way to the end of the Magdalenian 12,000 years ago. This site allows us the opportunity to understand what daily life might have been like during the Solutrean. Horses were hunted, butchered nearby, and then brought to the habitation site. Perhaps the next day, the hunters moved on to other sites where they could find more game. The site of Haut du Chanier, or the Rock of Solutre, is a truly amazing site, and perhaps you can understand why the entire culture would go by this name. Horses appear to have been a large part of the Solutrean diet in areas that they were common. North of the Pyrenees, reindeer were also very commonly hunted. In Iberia, the fauna was more diverse and their sites reflect this. Ibex, red deer, rabbits, aurochs, bear, cave lion, woolly rhinoceros, and mammoths all appear to have been hunted. Out of these animals, red deer, ibex, and rabbits appear to have been the most common prey items in Iberia. Smaller animals are typically harder to detect in the archaeological record due to the fragile nature of their remains. Early European archaeologists overlooked the role that some of these smaller animals played in the lives of prehistoric people. In Solutrean Iberia, rabbits made up an important part to the diet of many groups. Rabbits may not have the most meat, though they are often abundant and relatively easy to catch. Simple throwing sticks can be used to harvest them rather than a complicated well-made spear or dart. At some sites in Solutrean Iberia, hundreds or even thousands of rabbit remains can be found. At the site of Gruta del Quedarão in Portugal, 1,300 rabbit remains were found. Evidence indicates that they were directly hunted or trapped by Solutrean people. Larger and more dangerous animals would have been prey from time to time. Predators in general would have been a constant concern for these people. The butchery of carcasses would have attracted various animals ready to fight over their remains. Their heavy reliance on caves and rock shelters would have also led to some intense close-quarter encounters with bears and cave lions. These animals may have been largely avoided as we do not have much evidence of these encounters. Run-ins with angry prey animals would have also been just as dangerous. Even the average deer can cause significant injuries if unlucky. Hunts gone wrong with larger animals could have been fatal. Animals such as megaloceros, aurochs, and bison were hunted, and it is likely that even larger animals such as woolly rhinoceros and woolly mammoth were taken from time to time. The Solutreans certainly had the technology to take down these animals. As we know, some Gravettians were able to routinely take down mammoths with arguably simpler technology. Direct evidence of mammoth or rhinoceros hunting is not available, though it was certainly in their capability. Like other Upper Paleolithic cultures, many of the animals hunted by these people were heavily processed. During times of struggle, all of the meat, fat, bone marrow, and many of the organs were consumed. Heat-cracked rocks at Solutrean sites in Iberia suggest that they may have been used to boil water. They are often found associated with bones which may have been boiled to release their grease. Smashed bones have been found at archaeological sites since the Lower Paleolithic. This is typically because humans were getting at the calorie-rich marrow found inside. Though simply smashing the bones misses out on all the grease that lies in the spongy tissue. Boiling these bones allowed them to get access to all of the often overlooked calories. This grease could have been eaten right away or possibly mixed with dried meat to create pemmican. Pemmican is a calorie-dense food that can store for a long time and was often utilized by native people to make it through hard winters or to snack on during long journeys. Aquatic plants and animals were another resource that was relied upon during the Solutrean. Many Solutrean sites are found near the coast, and many are now submerged. Even the sites quite far from the coast display that aquatic resources were consumed and items such as shells were traded. Marine mollusks were commonly exploited across the shores of Iberia. At some sites, hundreds or even thousands of fish bones have been found. The remains of marine animals such as seals are occasionally found at their sites, though they were likely scavenged on the beach. At the site of Nerja in Spain, the bones of cod and sea bream have been found. These are marine fish that are not easy to catch from shore. It raises the possibility that these people were using some kind of watercraft in order to catch these fish. We know that Neanderthals and even Homo erectus were able to travel to islands vast distances off of shore. The Solutreans would have certainly been capable of creating some kind of primitive watercraft, though exactly what kind is not known. Dugout canoes seem like an obvious answer, though they typically need specialized adzes to be created, something we don't see in the Solutrean. It is possible more complicated animal-skinned or reed vessels were created, though this is just speculation at this point. Besides the coast, other aquatic resources were gathered inland such as trout and large salmon. These animals were likely speared as we do not have evidence of hooks from this time period, though hooks are often made of organic materials, so it's neither here nor there. Plants and fungi were also heavily relied upon during the Solutrean. Typically, it is difficult for them to be noticed in the archaeological record, though we do know the Solutreans were eating them. Crowberries and pine nuts have been found at one site. It is likely that plants and fungi are drastically underrepresented from our evidence at this time. The Solutrean range extended from limited parts of northern France all the way to southern Portugal. Across this range, temperature would have varied, though during the last glacial maximum it would have been quite cold even in southern areas. In the coldest months of winter, caves or very insulating shelters must have been used. Even in the short summers of the last glacial maximum, some kind of shelter beyond a sleeping bag may have been necessary. During the Solutrean, rock shelters and caves were heavily used while open-air sites were extremely rare. This is partly due to preservation bias, though in areas where Solutrean and Gravettian cultures overlap, we find many more open-air Gravettian sites. By mapping out Solutrean sites, it is clear that populations moved between established caves and rock shelters. Furthermore, these sites are found in favorable areas with plentiful game and fuel for their fires. The areas in between may have been intentionally avoided. Certain hunting stops between caves were used, such as Solutre, though only for short periods of time. Open-air camps may have been used frequently in warmer months, though our evidence is too fragmentary to say much more. One thing we can say about the Solutreans is that they kept contact with neighboring bands in a large kinship network. This cultural development seems to be one of the main reasons that the Solutrean culture was so innovative. Other cultures such as the Gravettians and Aurignacians were somewhat connected, though ideas do not seem to have spread far beyond basic cultural and technological elements. Though the Solutreans were restricted to a smaller area than previous cultures, they maintained contact between populations on both sides of the Pyrenees. This is quite an impressive feat considering how challenging it must have been to cross these mountains even in warmer months. Though people from southern Iberia may have had no idea of the Great Pyrenees and their kin that lied beyond them, a flow of information allowed knowledge and innovation to reach even remote areas. This contact is what allowed the development and spread of Solutrean technology in the first place. We can also imagine how much information vital for survival must have flowed between these groups. Knowledge about the movements of reindeer herds, food preservation, or how to create better tools would have been crucial for distant groups to learn about. Maintaining relationships even between neighboring groups would have been important in case of a failure of local game resources. It also would have been important for exchanging individuals for mating. Evidence of relationships between neighboring tribes can actually be identified in the traffic of non-local flints. High-quality flint was traded to tribes in regions with poor stone. We can imagine that these meetings may have been a time of trade, socialization, and even celebration. Though only speculation, larger kinship networks may have come together during scheduled times of the year around large hunts. These relatively local meetings would have had an impact on the larger network of Solutrean groups. Perhaps the development of laurel leaf points as a symbolic item was even connected to social relationships between groups. A discussion of their culture is not complete without mentioning the plethora of art that they created. Even defining art can be a contentious discussion, but objects and paintings made by these people cannot help but be interpreted as symbolic. The first of which we should mention was the use of pigment. As mentioned in the other two installments, pigment plays an important part in the culture of many contemporary indigenous people from the ethnographic record. Though Stone Age people are often depicted living in gray or dull worlds, our direct records of contemporary hunter-gatherers display quite the opposite. Various pigments, especially red ochre, is often used to cover tools, bags, weapons, and especially the body. On a day-to-day basis, individuals may have been painted casually as a form of identity. Rituals or cultural events may have warranted the painting of more complicated designs with heavily symbolic meanings. This is a phenomenon that we have seen all around the world in indigenous societies. Though evidence of dyed clothing or painted faces may not preserve in the archaeological record, it is highly likely that the Solutreans would have lived in a vibrant world of pattern and color. Another important symbolic element that cannot be overlooked is the use of jewelry. As stressed upon in prior episodes, jewelry can have extremely important symbolic meaning even in modern times. Wedding rings, earrings, or bracelets can all have significant value beyond their components. When looking at a broken shell or ivory bead, we may not simply be looking at a decoration, but an object of true value. The Solutreans, like other Upper Paleolithic people, used a variety of materials for their jewelry. Since they often lived near the coast, shells were commonly used as necklaces and pendants. They are even found inland at some sites. North of the Pyrenees, animal teeth were commonly used. This is a tradition that could date back as far as the Auric nation. Perforated beads are known throughout the Solutrean world. El Meron cave in Spain contains well-preserved beads which may have formed a necklace. In other areas, animal motifs and enigmatic symbols were etched and engraved into small pebbles or plaques. Parpayo cave in eastern Spain contains around 6,000 portable limestone rocks with paintings and engravings on them. They were made between 14 to 24,000 years ago, though many of them date to the Solutrean. They depict plants, animals, and geometric motifs and unknown symbols. Aurochs could weigh anywhere between 700 and 1,500 kilograms or between 1,500 and 3,300 pounds. The killing of such a massive beast would have certainly been celebrated. The plaques could represent a record of past successful hunts, though this is only speculation at the moment. Horses and ibex are frequently depicted in these plaques, perhaps supporting the idea that they were related to hunting. Some more unique plaques even show rare animals such as lynxes and canids, which may have been dogs. Human forms are found, though they only depict part of the body. A strange spiral-patterned engraving may have represented something with spiritual significance, though we do not really know. The plaques have been found among the debris of everyday life in the cave. Researchers are still unsure why this tradition was so localized in this cave, though some influence can be found elsewhere. Portable figurines or Venuses appear to have been completely absent in the Solutrean world. This is quite strange considering both the Auric nations and the Gravettians spent a lot of time carving animals, humans, and hybrids. Their artistic focus appears to have been elsewhere. Flutes are also lacking in Solutrean sites. This is not that surprising considering that flutes are quite delicate. They were made as far back as 40,000 years ago by the Auric nations and were also made by the Gravettians in later cultures. If any flutes or similar instruments were produced by the Solutrean people, they have not been preserved or discovered in the archaeological record. A musical instrument that we know they used was the bowl roarer. A bowl roarer is an ancient musical instrument and communication device, consisting of a flat, elongated piece of wood or bone attached to a long cord. When whirled through the air, the spinning of the wood produces a distinctive roaring or humming sound. A few beautiful examples have been found at Solutrean sites. Bowl roarers have been found in the earlier Gravettian period as well. They were likely highly prized objects. They were once famously used by Australian Aboriginals and persist in some communities. In these societies, they were used for long-distance communication, though they were also used ritualistically and ceremonially. In some indigenous Australian cultures, for instance, bowl roarers are considered sacred and often used in initiation ceremonies and other important cultural events. Other instruments that were likely used include whistles and drums. I was not able to find any direct evidence of these instruments from the Solutrean period, though they are known to have been used in preceding periods. Whistles can be very useful for coordinating hunts and communication, while drums are often used for ritual or healing ceremonies. The Solutrean was a time of cultural development, and cave art was no exception. Throughout the culture, art would develop in various mediums. Unlike the simplified outlines of the Gravettian, the Solutreans generally moved towards depicting more naturalistic and detailed designs. They also chose to focus on animals they hunted, such as deer, ibex, horse, and aurochs, unlike previous cultures which often had a focus on lions and mammoths. There is also evidence of the development of abstract symbols, perhaps suggesting proto-writing. There remains confusion with the exact dating of cave art sites across Western Europe, though enough have been firmly dated to identify certain trends. We will be covering all of the Solutrean cave art chronologically from the beginning of the culture to the end. One of the oldest dated Solutrean sites would be the Cave of Two Openings. I have butchered enough French in this video to attempt this pronunciation, but this is how it's spelled. This cave is known for its beautiful engravings of various animals, including mammoth, aurochs, and ibex. One engraving appears to depict a half-human aurochs creature. This cave appears to have carried on older traditions, perhaps all the way from the Auric nation. The next cave, known as La Pileta, is located in southern Spain, only 30 kilometers or 19 miles from the coast. Around 800 animal and abstract images were made in the cave, many of which were made during the Solutrean. Only one color was used for each image, and animals were often surrounded by symbols. Of the animals, aurochs, deer, dolphins, tortoises, fish, and people were engraved. Such a diversity in animal depictions is quite rare in the Paleolithic. Other engravings at the site, such as the abundance of lines, appear to have been some kind of calendar, though the exact meaning of the depiction is still unclear. At Le Placard cave in western central France, many images were made dating to the Solutrean. The cave is notable for many aviform designs, signs which were made by Gravettians at Pechmerly. I think I might give up on these French pronunciations. Here, an aviform design was painted right next to a scene of a wounded man. Could this image represent a warrior with outstretched legs, or the symbol of one's clan? We may never know. What we do know is that thousands of years later, Solutreans would make 11 of these same symbols 150 kilometers or 90 miles away at Le Placard cave. Could these people be the direct descendants of their Gravettian ancestors? We may never know. A smooth transition from the Gravettian to the Solutrean can be seen at the now underwater Coscar cave. The entrance now sits 37 meters or 121 feet underwater. Divers must swim a challenging 170 meters or 575 feet to reach the main chamber of the cave. During the Pleistocene, the sea level was much lower and the cave was of course not underwater. Unfortunately, around 80% of the cave has been submerged at one point or another, destroying much of the artwork. Though there still remain nearly 200 depictions of animals and hand stencils, most of which date to the Solutrean, though a significant amount date to the Gravettian. The artistic tradition indicates that this cave was continually used throughout the Gravettian and Solutrean transition. Inside, 63 horses, 28 ibex, 17 deer, 10 bison, and 7 aurochs can be found. Perhaps more interestingly, 9 seals, 3 great auks, and even jellyfish appear in the cave. It is unclear exactly when these depictions were made, though they likely date to the Solutrean. The fact that many aquatic animals were painted and the cave is now underwater can help us understand just how much of the Solutrean world now lies underwater. These people depended on the coast, and there may be just as many sites underwater as we could ever find above water. At the fantastic site of Roc des Serres, we find evidence of complex sculpture made during the Solutrean. It is famous for its 14 sculptured, engraved, and painted limestone blocks. 52 images of horse, muskox, bison, boar, and ibex were depicted. About 70% of the images were shaded with red ochre to convey movement. The images were created with great skill, especially for the time period. Powerful bison are depicted as aggressive, while horses appear to have been tall and proud. One of the most prominent sculptures depicts 2 male ibex which seem to be clashing, likely during rutting season. An image of what appears to have been a man may be the most interesting in the cave in my opinion. He appears to be holding a spear while running away from a pursuing muskox or aurochs. Another human figurine is seen facing away in the other direction of this scene. The way the artists depict humans during this time will always fascinate me. There always seems to be an emphasis on the legs and the waist. Could this image represent a hunt gone wrong? Does it represent real events or a story sacred to these people? We will never know. Further sandstone slabs are engraved with animal depictions, including horses and mammoth. Mammoths are not commonly depicted in the Solutrean, though this proves that they were a subject of attention. Overall, this cave proves that Solutrean artists were innovative in their creation of art. Another very intriguing cave art site from the Solutrean would be
La tête du lion.
For over a century, it has been speculated that Paleolithic people may have taken interest in the night sky to form parts of their beliefs. Various cave art sites have been used to argue that celestial bodies may have been painted. A panel containing an aurochs and 7 dots at this site may represent a depiction of the Pleiades star cluster while the moon cycle sits above it. The eye of the aurochs has been hypothesized to represent the star Aldebaran, the main star of the famous Taurus constellation. This depiction is very similar to another representation in Lascaux cave dating to the early Magdalenian. Though the evidence is not exactly concrete, it is possible that these people were depicting celestial bodies over 20,000 years ago. Another interesting cave known as the Cave of La Pasiega contains a large number of abstract symbols as well as animal depictions. The presence of such a diverse array of abstract signs and symbols may indicate a complex symbolic system. Some researchers have hypothesized that the symbols may have had a communicative purpose, perhaps some kind of primitive writing system. Regardless of what the symbols may have meant, the combination of animal depictions and abstract elements highlights the advanced artistic and cognitive abilities of Solutrean people. The practice of burial does not appear to have been underway during the Solutrean. Even during Gravettian times, burial appears to have been very uncommon west of the Alps. The lack of clearly identified Solutrean burials may be due to various factors, including the possibility that burial practices did not always involve elaborate or detectable interments, or simply that such sites have not been discovered or properly excavated. Whatever the case, this should not lead you to think that these people did not mourn their dead as intensely as we do today. They are humans after all, and the deaths of loved ones would have affected them deeply. Evidence has time and time again supported the idea that Paleolithic people, including other species such as Neanderthals, were compassionate in life and in death. The Solutrean culture would gradually fade throughout Western Europe, roughly coinciding with the end of the last glacial maximum. The production of laurel leaf points would reduce drastically by around 20,000 years ago. This is also correlated with the breakdown of long-distance trade. Without this trade, groups living in regions without quality stone would have had a hard time to even create laurel leaf points. People living north of the Pyrenees adopted an entirely different stoneworking technique based on much simpler but perhaps more practical tools. This techno-complex is known as the Batagulian culture. These tools were often focused on scrapers and the use of bladelets as inserts. Batagulian projectiles appear to have been made in a similar way to Gravettian or Aurignacian composite points. This is completely opposite of bifacial technology that the Solutreans had spent so much time mastering. The switch to less complex tools took place for hundreds of years in a process that researchers have coined de-Solutreanization. The change may have been due to challenging conditions that came with the end of the last glacial maximum. Though the world was becoming warmer, the changing climate would have brought with it vast changes that would have disrupted their way of life. The Batagulians spread across France and northern Spain, though some Solutrean traditions persisted elsewhere. The Solutrean world was already somewhat connected between the Pyrenees mountains, though this connection appears to have broken down at the end of the period. South of the Pyrenees, the Batagulian influence was limited. Bifacial traditions were carried on, though blade core and microlith technology would become dominant towards the end of the Solutrean. Some Solutrean laurel leaves are found in later Magdalenian layers, though it is unclear if these later Magdalenian people actually made them. They may have simply been found by Magdalenian people and held on as some kind of antiquity. There is no doubt that the flint knappers of the Magdalenian period would have been mind-blown by the quality of skill displayed on a laurel leaf point. Though the Solutrean tradition faded throughout its former territory, the subsequent Magdalenian culture would form from Solutrean populations. There does not appear to have been a die-off of Solutrean people. The Magdalenian techno-complex developed in the same key regions that the Solutreans originated from. The Magdalenians were able to spread from these regions all over Europe. Regions that had been abandoned since the late Gravettian were finally re-inhabited once again. The last glacial maximum was over and the Magdalenians would go on to thrive. We will cover this great culture in our fourth and final video in this series. We will also be mentioning more about the epic Gravettian culture in the next video. It is now time to discuss the elephant in the room, the Solutrean hypothesis. The Solutrean hypothesis is the highly controversial idea that the earliest migrations to the Americas came from the Solutrean people of Europe. More specifically, that Solutrean people traveled across Atlantic ice to make it to the Americas around 21,000 years ago. These Solutreans are then thought to have pioneered the later Clovis techno-complex. If proven true, this would overturn the mainstream hypothesis that the Americas were first inhabited by migrants from Northeast Asia. To be clear, the hypothesis is considered a fringe view, and very few scientists in any field support it, and most find the evidence to be more consistent with other hypotheses. Regardless, I think it is still important to go over the idea and the history of research surrounding it. The Solutrean hypothesis was first proposed in the 1970s after some researchers noticed similarities in bifacial technology of the Clovis and Solutrean cultures. The idea did not gain much attention until around 25 years ago when archaeologists Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution and Bruce Bradley of the University of Exeter brought new support for the hypothesis, notably in their 2012 book, Across Atlantic Ice. We will be covering all the major points brought up in the book as well as other topics relating to the hypothesis. The evidence will be accompanied by the criticism from other researchers. All sources are cited in the bibliography. The most important aspect of the hypothesis is based on the similarities in stone technology between Clovis and Solutrean industries. They both made large bifaces, which often used overshot flaking to rapidly thin them. Overshot flaking is a flint knapping technique that we discussed earlier. It consists of striking a stone platform with enough force to send a flake across the entire face to the other side of the preform. This takes off the opposing edge, but also rapidly thins out the biface. Poor execution of this technique can take too much material off of the opposing edge or destroy the piece entirely. The Solutreans appear to have been the first archaeological culture to actually control this technique. The Clovis culture, thousands of years later, would use this technique to some extent. Stanford and Bradley proposed that overshot flaking is more efficient than other thinning techniques and links these cultures together. Various researchers have found significant problems with the Solutrean hypothesis based on these conclusions. The problem with these supposed similarities is that overshot flakes are not necessarily unique to both of these cultures, nor are they necessarily the most efficient way to thin a biface. Overshot flaking is a natural consequence of the flint knapping process. I remember making many overshot flakes in my first few months of flint knapping, even though I had no idea what they were or how to control them. Obviously, Stanford and Bradley were aware that overshot flakes can be made by anyone. What is really in question is if Solutrean and Clovis flint knappers both controlled overshot techniques in a similar way. Archaeologists Metin Aaron and Robert Patton prove that overshot flaking is not more efficient than overface flaking techniques. They also found that overshot flaking techniques are not necessarily that common at Clovis sites. Furthermore, they proved that the amount of overshot flaking in Solutrean and Clovis assemblages differs statistically. Aaron and colleagues concluded the presence of overshot flakes in Clovis and Solutrean assemblages are accidental products created incidentally as knappers thin their bifaces. Another very important problem with the Solutrean hypothesis is the time gap. The Solutrean culture only made their famous laurel leaf bifaces between around 23 to 19,000 years ago. Clovis technology does not appear anywhere until around 13,500 years ago at the earliest. This gap of around 5,000 years is made more of a problem when considering that we do not find pre-Clovis cultures creating bifaces with Solutrean techniques. In their book, Across Atlantic Ice, Stanford and Bradley claim that 14 pre-Clovis sites support Solutrean influence. However, Metin Aaron and Robert Patton pointed out that only one overshot flake can be found in any of these 14 assemblages. In fact, the flaking used in these sites rarely passes the medial axis, or halfway across the point. These sites are clear evidence that the use of overshot flaking was not present in the Americas until the development of Clovis, supporting the idea that Clovis flint knapping techniques developed in the Americas. This is also supported by recent evidence displaying that the oldest Clovis sites are found in the southeast and expand westward and northward from there. We would have expected Clovis technology to appear in the northeast if it really did come from the Solutreans. I think another aspect that I've never heard mentioned when considering Clovis and Solutrean technology is that we clearly know that complex Solutrean technology developed in Western Europe in only around 1500 years. Solutrean technology as we know it developed from simple unifacial valley comprido points in less time than the gap between Solutrean and Clovis. It is completely reasonable that the Clovis knapping tradition appeared in the Americas with no outside influence. Bifacial knapping techniques have appeared independently all over the world. The oldest bifacial techniques appear in Africa over 70,000 years ago, and even transitional Neanderthal cultures used leaf-shaped bifacial points. Another significant problem with the idea that these technologies are similar is just how different the point designs are. Clovis points are lanceolate with hollow bases and prominent flutes. Let's not forget that fluting is part of what makes a Clovis point a Clovis point, and as far as we know, the Solutreans never fluted their points. Solutrean points, though they made many varieties, are typically large and leaf-shaped with a pointed base. Besides the fact that overshot flaking was used occasionally in both cultures, they really are not all that similar. 8,000 years ago, ancient Arabians invented fluted points that look far more like Clovis points than anything the Solutreans ever made, and this was 5,000 years after the Clovis culture. Should we also hypothesize that the Clovis maritime hunters crossed back over into the Middle East spreading their fluting techniques? This is a straw man of the ideas proposed in Across Atlantic Ice, because there are other technological similarities between Clovis and Solutrean that make the case more compelling. Still, the point I'm trying to make is that cultures can come up with very idiosyncratic tool designs without necessarily being connected. Considering that technological similarities were the basis for the Solutrean hypothesis in the first place, perhaps you can understand why archaeologists are unconvinced that there must have been a connection between these cultures, though the Solutrean hypothesis iceberg goes much deeper than this. The cover of the book Across Atlantic Ice contains an image of the Sinmar blade. This blade was dredged off the coast of Cape Charles along with a mastodon tusk which dated to 22,000 years ago. The chances of both of these items being dredged up at the same time is really quite incredible, and it was used by Stanford and Bradley as evidence in their book. However, many problems exist with this find. Dredging is not a precise process. These two items could have come from kilometers apart for all we know. The discovery of the blade was also not documented, so we don't even know if it was actually dredged up. They cannot be directly associated without further proof. The next problem is that this biface really doesn't look all that Solutrean. Solutrean points are quite long with a gradual slope on their blade, while the tang quickly slopes into a sharp point. This is in direct contrast to the Sinmar blade, which is quite rounded. The flake scars display that the blade was intentionally made this way, and it was not damaged during the dredging. It is entirely possible that this blade is from pre-Clovis times, though it does not look Solutrean, Clovis, or even in between. It also appears to resemble later bifacial knives made in the Archaic, though this is speculation. There are a few other technological similarities between Solutrean and Clovis which are coincidental. Blades were used by Clovis and Solutrean people as cutting tools and for creating scrapers. This is not very convincing considering that blades have been used by cultures all around the world, though they were made in a very similar way. Bone rods and spear points are found at Clovis and Solutrean sites. This is quite a coincidence, and there are other aspects that make the artifacts appear connected. Still, researchers are unconvinced that this evidence supports a connection between the cultures. The last supposed connection between these cultures would be their caches. Solutrean and Clovis people buried caches of tools, particularly bifaces. Clovis caches often include a variety of bone and stone tools, including rough cores, preforms, flake tools, and finished bifaces. Most Clovis caches seem to have been supplies that were meant to be recovered later, though one is associated with burial. Only one Solutrean cache has ever been found, and it is known as the Volgu cache. As we mentioned earlier, it consisted of 15 finished bifaces. This is completely different than any Clovis cache ever found. Overall, the technological and archaeological evidence is not consistent with a connection between these two cultures. There are of course arguments to be made on both sides, and Bruce Bradley continues to support the idea that the technology is connected. He is one of the most competent flint-knappers in the world, and smaller technological similarities that would take an hour to discuss support the hypothesis in his eyes. Other master flint-knappers disagree, but regardless, there is more evidence we can discuss that is not archaeological. One of the biggest problems with the hypothesis is that no genetic links have ever been made between Ice Age Europe and the Americas. All of the haplogroups in the Americas are very similar and are most closely related to populations living in Northeast Asia. However, there is some confusion with haplogroup X existing in the Americas. Haplogroup X can be found in Eurasia, North Africa, and the Americas, particularly in Eastern North America. This is a seemingly fantastic connection until you realize that Native American haplogroup X2A and X2G are not descended from the European X2B, X2D, or X2C clades. These clades share a common ancestor rather than a parental relationship. The X haplogroup is thought to have spread across Eurasia during the Upper Paleolithic and most likely spread through Beringia. no Native American haplogroups have ever been found in Europe or vice versa. Genetics do not support the Solutrean hypothesis, and geneticists unanimously agree that Native Americans descend from a founding population from Northeast Asia. I should mention that there is a possibility that Solutrean people lived in the Americas and left no genetic trace. This is hypothetically possible. We know it happened to some populations, such as the Dorset culture, which left no genetic trace after being replaced. Though with no evidence, we can currently say that the genetic evidence does not support the Solutrean hypothesis and rather fully supports more mainstream ideas. Another glaring issue that must be discussed is if it would have even been possible for Solutrean hunter-gatherers to migrate over 6,000 kilometers or 3,700 miles across Atlantic ice to get to the Americas. Studies have shown that even during the last glacial maximum, the North Atlantic was only frozen over 1 to 2 months out of the year. The ice sheet would have been extremely dangerous and would have consisted of floating glaciers over very deep water. These conditions may have not supported enough marine mammals or other wildlife to sustain Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers for such a treacherous voyage. Furthermore, no Solutrean or Clovis sites display that these people hunted large marine mammals or were even adapted to living in such hostile environments. Remember, the Solutreans retreated away from Central Europe and even northern France during the last glacial maximum. Again, it is hypothetically possible that some Solutreans were highly advanced seal and whale hunters and had technology to complete one of the most monumental voyages in human history. Though this discussion is not about possibilities, it is about reality and what we have evidence for. As research continues, the Solutrean hypothesis is becoming more and more obscure, while other hypotheses regarding the habitation of the Americas are gaining support. The Kelp Highway hypothesis posits that seafarers from the coast of Northeast Asia were able to migrate into the Americas along the ecologically rich kelp forests of western North America. Various species of kelp can be directly eaten for sustenance and other medical purposes. Kelp forests are home to abundant fish, invertebrates, and marine animals. Ironically, there are a lot more easily accessible marine animals on the west coast of the Americas than there would have been on the ice sheets of the mid-Atlantic. Another hypothesis, called the Mammoth Steppe hypothesis, is the idea that the ancestors of the Native Americans simply walked into North America before the ice sheets closed. The Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets blocked any land passage into the Americas from roughly 22,000 to 13,000 years ago. But before this period, we know that there was a direct land route of Mammoth Steppe from Eurasia right into the Americas. It was once thought that humans were not able to survive near or in the Arctic Circle during the Upper Paleolithic. Though the discovery of the Yana rhinoceros horn site proves that humans had adapted to the Mammoth Steppe biome even north of the Arctic Circle 32,000 years ago. Other Eurasian sites support the idea that humans were adapted to the Mammoth Steppe as far back as 40,000 years ago. The footprints found at White Sands dating to between 21 and 23,000 years ago could have been made by people who had simply walked into the Americas. It sounds like I need to make a whole video about the peopling of the Americas. Perhaps I will wait until a new discovery is made. Overall, there are many connections between the Solutrean and Clovis cultures that made the Solutrean hypothesis legitimately interesting. Both Stanford and Bradley admitted that their ideas were a hypothesis that required further evidence to prove. Subsequent research has resulted in the abandonment of the hypothesis by nearly all researchers across multiple fields. Bruce Bradley still supports the idea, and I encourage everyone to listen to his interview on the Prehistory Guys podcast. He discusses in depth his viewpoints on the archaeology of some of these sites and some of the more complicated topics around flint knapping. Though I have spent a good deal of time explaining why the Solutrean hypothesis has serious problems, I do want to encourage you to hear his perspective on the topic. There is still so much we have to learn about who, how, and when humans first made it into the Americas. Though unless further evidence comes to light, we can confidently say that the first people to make it to the American continent were not Upper Paleolithic Europeans. Unfortunately, there are some communities online that use the Solutrean hypothesis for white supremacist narratives, though I don't want anyone to confuse the great work of Stanford and Bradley with these ideas. It was truly a bold hypothesis that had a lot of intriguing evidence, and we should remember it in this way. The clash of academics that went into proving and disproving this hypothesis has led to some amazing research. Hopefully more bold hypotheses will come along in the future, whether they will be found supported or unsupported. Well, I think this is the first video I have made with 2 conclusions. But I hope all this talk about the Solutrean hypothesis has not made you forget about the truly fascinating Solutrean culture. I would like to think that they would be proud of future cultures talking in depth about their ingenious stoneworking abilities and even hypothesize about their capability to complete a truly monumental journey. I have truly enjoyed writing and researching this video, and I am happy I waited this long to cover both of these topics. I hope you enjoyed the 3rd installment of this series, and now it is time to get to work cataloging all of the impressive art made during the Magdalenian period. This has been your host, Northo2, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Leave a comment saying Laurel Leaf if you made it this far in the video. I really appreciate all of you that have. I also wouldn't mind a thumbs up and a share to some of your friends either. Alright, te veré en la próxima. I started learning Spanish now, guys, but I think I still got the Italian accent, sorry.